The room fell silent as Karoline Leavitt's hand gripped the witness stand. Her eyes, resolute and unwavering, met Judge Hargrove's. He wasn't just on trial, his entire legacy was. The air in the courtroom hummed with tension, the kind that made the weight of every breath feel like a verdict. Outside, a sea of protesters chanted, their voices rising and falling like a storm, while cameramen swarmed the entrance, their lenses capturing every flicker of emotion on Karoline's face. This was no ordinary trial. This was the reckoning of a man who had once shaped the laws of California with a pen and a nod, now forced to answer for the lives he had shattered with a gavel. He used to silence dissenters. Now he's the one on trial. The courtroom was a theater of contradictions. On one side, the polished veneer of justice, mahogany benches, gavels resting like dormant weapons, the stern gazes of the justices who had long served as Hargrove's allies. On the other, Karoline stood, a woman in her early 30s, her dark hair pinned back in a way that made her seem both fierce and fragile. She wore a simple navy suit, the fabric crisp but unadorned, a deliberate rejection of the opulence that had defined her opponent's world for decades. Her voice, when it came, cut through the quiet like a blade. "Your Honor, I'm not here to deliver a speech. I'm here to tell the truth about what this man has done." She turned, her gaze sweeping across the gallery, past the reporters, past the protesters, past the men and women who had once bowed to Hargrove's authority. "He didn't just break the law, he broke people." The judge's brow furrowed. "Miss Leavitt, I trust you'll refrain from personal commentary and stick to the facts." Karoline's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Aren't the facts enough, Your Honor?" The courtroom leaned in. The case against Judge Hargrove, former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, centered on the 2018 ruling that had effectively criminalized dissent under the guise of public safety. The law, signed into effect with Hargrove's blessing, had targeted activists, journalists, and political opponents, labeling them threats to the state's stability. Karoline had lived this law firsthand. As a congressional representative from San Diego, she had watched her colleagues disappear into the shadows of the justice system, their cases dismissed with a wave of Hargrove's hand. But this trial was not about her. It was about the woman who had once been the quietest voice in the room. Lena Morrow, a former aide to Judge Hargrove, sat in the audience, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had been the one to uncover the truth, the one to hide the evidence, and then finally the one to expose it. The first piece of evidence arrived like a thunderclap, a leaked recording from Hargrove's private office, dated just weeks after the controversial law's passage. Karoline played it with the precision of a surgeon. "We need to make an example," Hargrove's voice boomed, cold and clipped. "Leavitt's people are too vocal. Her district is a hotbed of unrest. If we don't act, they'll start thinking they can challenge the system." The room went still. A journalist in the gallery slumped forward as if the words had physically struck him. Karoline's voice cut through the silence. "This is not a political trial, Your Honor. It's a moral one. This recording proves that Judge Hargrove orchestrated a campaign of suppression, targeting individuals like me for speaking out." Hargrove's face darkened. "This is hearsay, no evidence that this conversation took place." "Your Honor," Karoline countered, "the recording was discovered on a server that once belonged to the state's legal department. It was wiped clean 2 days after the law was signed, but I had a copy thanks to someone who finally had enough." The weight of her words settled over the courtroom. The judge's face flickered with something unreadable, but he did not respond. The second witness took the stand. Marcus Rivera, a journalist whose investigative report on Hargrove's connections to corporate donors had been abruptly halted by a court order. He had been threatened, his sources disappeared, and his career reduced to whispers. "I was told that if I published the story, I'd lose my license," Rivera said, his voice trembling but steady. "But I found out the truth. Judge Hargrove had been receiving millions from legal firms under the table. The law he pushed wasn't about public safety. It was about silencing people who might ask uncomfortable questions." The gallery erupted. A reporter shouted, "Is it true he had someone followed?" Rivera nodded. "Yes, my wife was stalked. My children were threatened. I had to leave the state." The judge's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. "This is a smear campaign, Miss Leavitt. You're trying to make this about your own grievances." Karoline stepped forward, her voice rising. "No, Your Honor, it's about the people who were crushed under his weight. It's about the families who lost their homes, their jobs, their voices. You called it a law, I call it a weapon." Her words hung in the air like smoke. The judge's face was a mask of fury, but his hands, Karoline noticed, shook ever so slightly. A flicker of vulnerability hidden behind the veneer of authority, she leaned into it. "Your Honor, let's talk about the cross on your desk," she said, her tone sharp. "It's a symbol of faith, isn't it? But I wonder, did you ever wonder what your victims believed? Did you ever wonder what they took from their homes before they were dragged into court? Did you ever think about the families who watched them vanish?" Hargrove opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. The cross on his desk, simple and unassuming, seemed to glint in the courtroom light. Then came the final blow. Lena Morrow, trembling but resolute, testified that Hargrove had ordered her to delete records of certain cases involving activists, journalists, and political dissidents. She had refused, and in retaliation her family had been targeted. Her son had been arrested on fabricated charges. Her husband had been fired from his job. "I finally understood," she said, her voice breaking. "He's not a judge. He's a predator, and he's been hunting people for years." The courtroom was a cacophony of gasps and murmurs. Hargrove's face was pale, his composure shattered. Karoline stepped toward him, her voice low and cutting. "You taught us to fear the law, now you'll learn to fear the truth." As the gavel fell, the verdict was not yet clear, but the room had changed. The protesters outside chanted louder, their voices a rising tide. Karoline looked out at the crowd, her eyes meeting Lena's, then Rivera's, then the faces of the millions who had been watching on screens across the country. The cross on the judge's desk seemed to burn in the light. "This trial isn't the end, it's the warning."